Welcome everybody to our fifth, I believe, in our series of grapes webinar. Today our speakers are Carl Rosen from the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the University of Minnesota, and he also has a joint appointment with the Department of Horticulture and is in charge of many nutrition studies that we are doing as part of the Northern Grapes Project. I'm going to mute you for a moment here, Carl, because I'm getting feedback. So he will start the presentation, then we'll switch over to Paul Domoto. We will have a break in the middle to address questions. And each of these presentations is going to last about 20-25 minutes, and we'll break in the middle for questions, and again have questions at the end. So please use the chat bar. Have the send to button on the chat bar set to everyone, and feel free to type in questions or comments at any time during the presentations. So I would like to turn it over to Carl now, and we'll just get started with the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim, and greetings from Minnesota. As Tim said, we're going to be talking about vine nutrition today. My co-presenter is Paul Domoto. I'm an extension soil scientist at the University of Minnesota, so my presentation will primarily involve the aspects of soil, and Paul's will go over into the tissue analysis. So the general topics that we'll be covering today, we'll be looking at soil testing and basic nutrient management for vineyards before planting. And then Paul will get into the petiole analysis and tissue analysis and some of the details sampling and interpreting some of those results. So that's kind of the outline for the day. In terms of determining the need for fertilizer and soil amendments, there are various ways of doing that. Of course, you can look at vine vigor and visual symptoms. This should always be done. However, if you start seeing visual symptoms and problems in the field, your yield and quality are likely already being affected. And so having diagnostic procedures to help you guide your inputs that may be needed makes a little more sense. So look at soil testing as a way of getting started, and then petiole analysis for monitoring things as the things are established are two diagnostic tools that help guide your guide inputs that may be needed. In terms of nutrients or essential plant elements that are needed by the grapevines, basically there are 14 that are derived from the soil or fertilizer. We break into macronutrients and micronutrients. The macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the ones that are needed in highest quantity by the vines. Secondary nutrients, sulfur, magnesium, and calcium are also needed in relatively large quantities, but not to quite the degree as the primary macronutrients. And then you have about seven or so micronutrients that are needed in small quantities, very essential for the plants, but fortunately most of our soils have adequate amounts to supply. There are situations, however, where micronutrients are important, and there are situations where micronutrients are important, and we'll get into those in just a little bit. Okay, so taking a look at a little bit of feedback from someone there. Okay, so taking a look at soils in terms of what needs to be done pre-plant, basically we're looking at adjusting pH, looking at phosphorus and potassium levels, bringing those up to optimum levels, and then looking at in years after the first year of planting, we continue to monitor the pH, and then also look at potassium soil, which is also one of the nutrients that tends to give us problems in vineyard plantings. One thing to note is that in some cases the soil test is not accurate for certain nutrients, and we'll get into those in just a little bit. Paul will be talking a lot more about the petiole analysis, but just can note that during the first year, petiole analysis is not very accurate, mainly because what you're seeing is what is reflected from the nursery from where you purchased your grapevines. Afterwards, second year and beyond, petiole analysis is a very accurate tool, and that Paul will be going into shortly. In terms of availability of essential nutrients, this can be affected by many different factors. Obviously, the parent material on which your vid is being grown has a very direct impact. Composition, how that soil is formed, the pH of your soil, which is related to the parent material, texture, how well water moves into that soil, how much leaching occurs, and so forth will affect nutrient availability. Your soil organic matter content also is a source of nutrients, a slow release source, and it will also affect what the nutrient of those vines. You have competition between certain nutrients. Potassium and magnesium, for example, can be very competitive and can cause some problems, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. And previous fertilizer history, that yield was managed prior to putting in a vineyard will also affect nutrient availability. Soil testing is probably the most important tool that you can do before planting. It is something that takes a lot of the guesswork out of determining what's needed for your vineyard. If you're going to do it once, do it before planting. Afterward, in many cases, it's late to make adjustments, very difficult to make those adjustments. So before planting is the time to do some testing. After that, maybe every 3 or 4 years, 4 or 5 years, or when there's a problem that might be occurring. You can use it to help supplement your soil, your petiole testing and tissue testing, established vineyards, but as I mentioned, before planting is the most critical time. In terms of what to test for when you're doing soil test, pH is probably the most important soil parameter, followed by phosphorus and potassium. We have soil tests that are very well calibrated for adjusting any amendments that might be needed for those properties. Calcium, magnesium, zinc, boron, and sulfur are also other elements that can be tested for. Those tests can be useful and would be good to know before planting. We also suggest getting an organic matter test. This is used to adjust nitrogen rates. The higher your organic matter, the more nitrogen will be available to your vines from the soil itself. In terms of collecting a sample, this is probably one of the most important aspects of getting a good soil test. The sample that you collect is really only as accurate as the samples that you submit. So in many cases, we have lots of different labs that can do the soil test, but sampling is often the weakest link. If it's not representative of the area that you are planning to fertilize or amend, then it's not going to do much good. So make sure that you get a good representative sample. To do this, we recommend dividing the field into uniform areas. Do it that soil type or slope, crop history. If it's a very uniform field, you can go up to about 20 acres, but most of the vineyards that I've seen are usually on very rolling hills and areas, so you'd want to break that up into smaller parcels, perhaps 2 to 3 acres, and then submit the samples. For each sample, they should be representative of that area, so collect about 15 to 20 cores. in a random pattern through the field. Once you collect those samples, and you want to go to a depth of about 8 inches, that's what our soil tests are calibrated on, that depth. You can do a second depth of 8 to 16 inches, but the recommendations are generally based on that 0 to 8 inch depth. You want to thoroughly mix those subsamples, those 15 to 20 subsamples, in a plastic container, and then submit about a pint of that sample to a lab. If the soil's very wet, we suggest air drying it first, or dry it, but don't heat into higher than 97 degrees Fahrenheit, because that can affect some of the nutrient levels through that process. So air drying is best. This is just an example of what soil information sheet. When you submit your sample, you're going to have to provide a certain amount of information, what the field is, what crop you're going to be fertilizing, and so forth. And then you'll have different that you'll select. In most cases, for initial sample grapes, I would suggest getting a suite of nutrients, particularly phosphorus, potassium, soil organic matter, sulfur, zinc, and some of the other micronutrients, calcium and magnesium. Those would be ones that I think would give you a good baseline for most to start. When you submit your sample, it will take about usually a week or two, depending on the lab, to get your results back. And this is again from our particular lab at the University of Minnesota, but there is a lot of labs throughout the country that can perform these analyses. The notes that you get back then will be interpreted, and you'll get a recommendation back. So for this particular sample, we had organic matter of about 3%. PH was 5.5. This comes with a lime recommendation to bring it up to a pH of 6. We have a nitrogen recommendation, but this is not based on a nitrate test. It's mainly based on our organic matter content. And then a phosphorus, potassium, zinc, calcium, and magnesium that we analyzed in this particular sample, with corresponding recommendations of amounts to apply. Okay, in terms of interpretation, some labs interpret the levels a little differently than others. What I suggest is choosing a lab that can reflect your local conditions. So, for example, Ohio State University is on the left here. This is Iowa State, University of Minnesota, and this is the North Regional Committee that has come up with some recommendations. And if you look at the general levels, we're all relatively in agreement in most cases for these, but there are some slight differences depending on what location you are in the country. So let's take a look a little bit closer at pH. In terms of pH for grapes, ideally for most of the varieties except for perhaps the Labruscas, you want to be in that slightly acid range, 6 to 7. Low pH, if you're too low, if you're more in the more acid range, it's easily modified before planting. It's very difficult to modify it after planting. So this is a reason why you want to get that soil test first. High pH is often also a problem, particularly if you have high carbonates. It's difficult to change high pH, but we'll get into some options in just a little bit. In terms of why pH, soil pH is kind of a really dominant chemical property in soils. It affects not only nutrient availability, but it also affects microbial activity in the soil. And if you look at this chart here, it goes from pH of 4 to 9, general, going acid to basic conditions. And you can see that many of your bacteria, minimycetes, tend to be limited as you get below about 5.5. These microorganisms are very important in turning over nutrients in the soil and are inhibited if the soil pH isn't optimal. Also, if you have any legumes as in planting, those legumes are associated with bacteria, and those will also be affected by negatively at too low a pH. Many of your macronutrients like nitrogen, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur tend to be limited at low pH. Phosphorus is also very limited at high pH. And then micronutrients, particularly iron, becomes very limiting at high pH as well. So in terms of optimal pH for nutrient availability and microbial activity, we look at a slightly acid range between 6 and 7. Modified soil pH, generally, if you're in the acid range, you need to apply lime. It's recommended if the pH is less than 6. It's based on how well the amount of lime is based on how much or how well your soil is buffered. Lime also adds calcium and magnesium. And if you're low in magnesium, using dolomitic lime will also provide that nutrient as well. Surface applications of lime are not very effective. You need to incorporate that lime 8 to 10 inches, and again, apply that before planting, at least 1 year before planting to get it to work. Lime is kind of slow to react with the soil, and well in advance is an important thing to do. Now, if your pH is too high, consider acidifying the soil, but depending on the type of soil that you're in, acidification can be very difficult and expensive, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. This is what we call iron chlorosis. If you have very high pH, it's usually in that 7.5 to 8 range. You can run into this this yellowing between the veins. Generally, the plant loses vigor. Generally does not grow very well. This is due to iron availability problem. Generally, your soils have plenty of iron, but that high pH limits availability. So if that is a problem, what do you do? Lowering that pH, if at all possible, is one option. If you're between 6.5 to 7, probably not the probably you're almost in the ideal range unless you're in the Labrisca types of beasts. To low pH, you'd use elemental sulfur. However, if you're in that range, just using acidifying forms of nitrogen fertilizer can use like ammonium sulfate and urea. And, organic sources tend to be acidifying over time. So if you're kind of slightly acid 6.5 to 7 range, probably you don't have to worry too much about it unless you're growing Labrisca types. The 7 to 7.5 range, applying elemental sulfur for it is recommended. You can also use acidifying forms of fertilizer. You can see that there are other acidifying sources in addition to elemental sulfur. Aluminum sulfate and ferrous sulfate can also be used. However, elemental sulfur is usually the most economical source. When we get above 7.5, then it gets a little tricky to lower your pH to acidify your soil. And this is particularly the case if you have free carbonates in your soil. And if you do have a lot of free carbonates, it's going to be very expensive to get that pH down. And what we recommend is if you're having iron chlorosis problems on those high pH soils with free carbonates, to use iron chelates, soil-applied iron chelates, to correct the problem. Of acidifying the soil, again, the amount to apply is going to depend on your soil texture and how much organic matter you have. The higher amount of clay and the higher organic matter, the more elemental sulfur you'll need to apply. So for example, at a pH of 7.5, you'd need about 1,400 pounds on a clay soil, whereas in a sandy soil, you'd need a little over 400, maybe 400 to 500 pounds. So the amount to apply of elemental sulfur will depend on your texture and organic matter content. In terms of determining whether you have 3-calcium carbonate in your soil, a very simple test to run is the fizz test. That entails just putting on some acid, even vinegar, household vinegar. If you get bubbles, that means that you have 3-calcium carbonate. I say if you are in the range of barely audible to less than that they can use elemental sulfur. If you see a few bubbles to many bubbles, I would not recommend using a lot of elemental sulfur because it's going to just get neutralized and you won't be able to acidify your soil very much. In that case, use iron chelates. If you use iron chelates, something that would have to be done year after year because it's only a temporary fix, but it does help to solve the iron chlorosis problem. Okay, other fertilizer additions before planting. Again, base your phosphorus and potassium needs on a soil test. You can also base magnesium, zinc, and boron. However, those can be applied either fully early or afterwards, but phosphorus and potassium need to be taken care of before planting. It's very difficult to correct them afterward because they're not very mobile in the soil. Again, broadcast and incorporate to a depth of about 8 to 10 inches. In terms of recommendations based on a soil test, what I have here is the relative soil test level. And these are usually categorized by the soil testing laboratory, going from very low to very high. And this would be at least the recommendations that we would recommend in the upper Midwest for the amount of phosphate to apply before planting based on the soil test. Then in terms of potassium, a similar chart. Again, these would be the recommendations. Very obviously, as your soil test is low, you have a higher amount to apply than if you're in a very high soil test range. Again, these recommendations would come with your soil test report. In terms of what happens if you do not know your soil before planting, you can see, depending on the amount of clay, particularly if you're going to have a finer textured soil, one with a fair amount of clay in it, it's very difficult to move that potassium down, and what will happen, it accumulates in the top few inches. So that's one of the reasons why you want to make sure you get some of these amendments on before planting. This is a similar slide for magnesium, then breaking it to low, medium, high. Under low ting magnesium soils, there would be a recommendation of about 100 pounds of magnesium per acre planting before planting. Soil organic matter content. This is a property of the soil that's important to know because it affects how much nitrogen is available to your plants. The higher your organic matter, the more nitrogen is available. We usually like to see, for grapes anyway, lower organic matter because otherwise you're going to have excessive, once you get into this 4, 5, 6% range of organic matter, you're going to get excessive vine growth, and that's going to entail a lot of, require you to do a lot of pruning. So ideally, you want to be in this kind of medium to low range for organic matter. It set the vines up well, but you're not going to get that excessive growth. We adjust our fertilizer recommendations initially to that organic matter content. And in general, for non-bearing vines, depending on your organic matter, if you're in very high range of organic matter, you may not need to apply any nitrogen. If you're in the medium range, a small amount of nitrogen to get those vines going. And if you're in the low range, we do recommend some nitrogen just to get that vigor up. Account for any nitrogen that comes from manure. If you're using manure or compost or any kind of legume cover crops, this will also supply nitrogen. And so you want to be aware that vine growth will also be affected by those sources as well. So we suggest applying nitrogen after planting, like phosphorus and potassium, which are very immobile in the soil. Nitrogen is mobile, and surface applications will eventually get down to your root system with rainfall. So with that, I think I'll take a break for questions. There are a number of questions here.
And I have a few too, Carl.
Okay. Sorry, I missed the optimum P level. What do you consider very low, high? Okay, so again, it kind of depends on the soil test that you're using. Depending on which area of your state that you're in, we use a Bray test, and we also use the Olsen test. If you're using Bray test, I would say the optimum level is somewhere between 25 and 30. And if you're using the Olsen test, it's about 5 parts per million less, so about in the 20 range for the Olsen test. So again, it depends on the soil test that you're doing, but again, the soil testing lab will provide that information for you, and the fertilizer recommendation if it's needed. Okay, so maybe I missed this. When should you collect the sample? You can basically take the sample any time of the year. Usually, we suggest taking it in the fall or in the spring, but it's not that critical in terms of the actual time. It's usually what's most convenient. The most important thing is to collect the sample. The time's not quite important, particularly for vineyards where you have a perennial crop that is going to be in there for many, many years.
Okay, Carl, I have another one here that came in privately from Evan Burial. Are these optimum nutrient levels based on a melic tree extraction? That's the technical.
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. I mentioned that we use the Bray test and the Olsen test for phosphorus, and we also use ammonium acetate extractable for our other nutrients. The melic test is kind of a combination of those tests. We generally see good correlation with our other tests. It's a new test that's used, and I would say that from the north central region is probably using melic. In Minnesota, we don't use melic very much because as you get into very high pH soils, the melic test does not work very well. So we haven't switched to the melic test for that reason. But those values that I had there will work for the melic test, particularly if you're on non-calcareous soils.
Carl, I have another one from Les Curry. Any thought on correcting pH with pelletized lime?
Okay, pelletized lime. That's another good question. The pelletized lime is basically limestone, very finely ground limestone that is kind of, it's basically formed into pellets. And it's just like regular lime. It's a little more expensive. It's a little faster acting. So it's just as effective. The one thing that you want to do with pelletized lime, though, is once you apply it and incorporate it, you may need to do a second incorporation because it is pelletized. It's not as uniformly distributed as regular ag lime. And so you tend to get hot spots there. Eventually it diffuses out, but mixing it in twice might be a little more effective.
Okay, we have a few more questions here, but I think I'll save them for the end. and we should move on to Paul. Paul, I have unmuted your microphone. I'm going to return the presentation over to you now, and we'll try and deal with some of these questions in the chat bar as well, if Carl wants to chime in on any of them, and we'll do that while Paul is speaking, and then address other questions at the end. Okay, Paul.
Thank you, Tim. As Carl said, he's covered the soil portion, and I'm going to be covering the petiole analysis. And of course, here, petiole analysis is really the most reliable method for determining the nutrient needs of an established vineyard. And of course, because the vine telling you what's available to it, and so you have a pretty good idea. Also, Carl mentioned, symptomology. Petiole analysis allows us to get in there, determine a need before we see symptoms, so it's really helpful that way. And of course, if you're going to do it right, really ideally, submit samples on a yearly basis. That enables you to infer, establish sufficiency, deficiency ranges, and by doing so, you could really fine-tune your fertilizer nutrient program in the vineyard. And of course, some expertise is needed for the interpretation, but again, it will come with experience, and it allows you to adjust for site-specific factors. Hey, boy. How do I answer, Tim?
Up at the top, the right arrow.
Oh, okay, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so, we talk about critical ranges of nutrient level sufficiency ranges, and this is just an example that, we have, of course, efficiency, we go into the adequate range. If we get too much, we go into luxury, and if we really over at the top, we get into toxicity. Of course, what sufficiency is that it's that area that the plants are performing well, and over time, of course, that has come about by years of tagging from labs and putting the literature together, and it gets that area where they do well. If we do the latter, and we're going to avoid deficiencies, and we're going to also a situation where we're not going to overdo the applications as well. As far as factors that affect the nutrient levels, there are many. Crop load is one particular that can have an influence on a year-to-year basis. The colors or rootstocks, or what we call Farana rootstock, they do behave differently, and we can find differences in varieties from one particular site. Cultural practices also, there's any going down, and some even your spray control program, your control program can have an influence. Insect and disease incidents will have an effect, and of course growing conditions and weather in particular, and really a lot of that has to do with moisture relations. Some of our nutrients, if we have excessive moisture or lack of moisture, they are not taken up as well by the plants. So really comes in and affects analysis. Okay, as far as time do sampling, we have two times. One at full bloom, typically mid to late June in our northern climates, and then what we refer to as the mid-July to mid-August period, or we can be a little more specific there and say the early brison period. The period, the mid-August, generally provides more accurate assessment of the nutrient needs, and particularly with potassium and nitrogen, because these are two nutrients that the content declines over the growing season. And during that period, mid-July to mid-August, the decline is at a slower rate than compared to from bloom to death mid-July period. So it gives us a little more accurate there. We have a lot more data on it as to what it needs. But even with that decline, if we go in and, we want to try to collect at the same time. If we go in and do it at early horizon, then we have a physiological event occurring in vines that we can, regardless of weather conditions from year to year. Because last year's warm growing season was a good example of that. Now, as far as potency ranges, we have, for the two, we have the bloom and mid-July to mid-August. That bloom that just from the Plant Analysis Handbook by Mills and Jones, whereas the mid-July to mid-August is from Fertilizing Fruit Crops, an old Ohio State bulletin. But even there, that is still available in the Midwest Grape Production Guide. It's the same one with the exception of molybdenum. Now, you'll see some question marks, and I'm a nutrition physiologist, and I have concerns about some of these rates because it's not only they more so on the high end compared to the low end of the range. Although with potassium, we know it does decline and, during the growing season. So if you had a 1.5% at bloom, it's going to be even lower in the early horizon, mid-July, mid-August. So for the question mark there. Sulfur, most analyses will say, or ranges say no data, and that's one of the reasons that sulfur has been used as a fungicide on grapes for a number of years, and in many areas is still being used. And so both I and Carl kind of agree that if we have over 0.1%, we consider it adequate. Now, and this is the Grape Production Guide for Eastern North America, or what Cornell uses, again at bloom, and they call for 70 to 100 days after bloom again, following. It's about the same period, and or early horizon. A few question marks on this. The calcium, the high end there at bloom, because calcium is an accumulator. I wonder about that compared to the other. And magnesium, I'm in a situation where we run into excessive magnesium in our soils, and I've seen at 0.75% an inhibition of potassium uptake at that level. And of course, manganese, I know that eastern soils are higher, or more acid, so they have high levels, but that seems kind of high for me, the high end. Now, as far as collecting the samples, again, collect at the same time each year, whether it's at bloom or at the early horizon period. We key in, mix colors into one sample, because there are differences, or can be differences between cultivars. And if plant is located on more than one soil type, just as Carl talked about soil sampling, collect separate field samples for each of the soil types. If the plant received different fertilizer applications or treatments, then separate samples should also be collected. As far as the size of the sample, collect between about 100 petioles per sample, but on the small petiole cultivars such as Marquette or Marshall Foch, maybe 150 to 200 petioles will be needed. As far as collecting the petiole sample, collect it randomly from represented vines in a designated sampling area. Collect petioles from bearing shoots at full bloom, petioles opposite the first cluster, midsummer or early horizon, most recently full expanded leaves. Now, collect no more than one petiole per shoot. Avoid sampling abnormal, weak, and healthy vines unless they will be sampled and submitted separately. We'll get into more of that in a bit. And choose leaves free from insects, disease, and mechanical injury. And it's really, really important to get really normal leaves when you do collect. So, full bloom, it's going to be that leaf opposite the first cluster. In some of our northern hybrids, that first cluster is often at the second node or second leaf, and often it's very, very difficult to find normally developed leaves at that early stage of development. Some are recently fully expanded leaf. In a year, but somewhere between the fifth and seventh leaf. If we have dry conditions, it may, this growth load, it may be at that fourth leaf or in the third if it's really, really not stressed. Now, clean sample. Here, best allow nature to take care of this by collecting after a heavy rain. However, if samples are dirty or if foliar nutrients are recently applied, and rinsing the sample in a mild detergent solution followed by 2 distilled or deionized rinse are recommended. The leaves should be washed while they're still fresh, and after rinsing, patted dry with clean paper towels. And if you do, the whole process should be completed within a minute. And the reason for the time interval there is that potassium can be leached out of the tissue if you get wet very long. Okay, let's prepare samples, remove the leaf plates. And here, really, really important to do not use metal utensils. I've had samples come in where I apparently used scissors to remove the the petioles, and the iron content readings were off the chart on that, very, very high. But place petioles in a neat paper bag or bag provided by the laboratory, and then on that bag identify the sample by their name, your name, crop, car, field, sample number. Now, because we get so much information from petio analysis by doing it on an annual basis, it's a good idea to use the same code so that from year to year, and so that you come back and reference and you know where the field was that sample come from the previous year. Map, identify each sampling area for your future references, and then submit the sample. Now, troubleshooting. Now, if you diagnose a specific symptom, then send 2 samples. Okay, one from vine showing the symptom, and from vines not showing the symptom. And this process can be done anytime during the growing season. It is restricted because we looking at them are able to compare the two samples to identify the problem. Now, sample to a lab for analysis. There's university labs, there's commercial labs, but most of those labs will provide an interpretation of the results. What you should do, however, is make sure the lab uses sufficiency ranges for the time sampled. And of course, if you have any doubts, send your results to an extension specialist to look over the interpretation. Including a sample. Here, petio analysis is not an exact science. It can tell you if you need to apply more or less of a nutrient, and because of that, the more information available, the better. Any testing allows us to fine-tune for the program, and if you're set for someone to interpret this additional information, we suggest the health and vigor vines, the soil texture, internal drainage classification, previous soil testing results, action potential for current and previous seasons, current and past fertilizer program, materials applied prior to collecting the sample, micronutrient-containing fungicides. This is a really important one to let the person know, and of course, if you're using any foliar nutrient sprays as well. This is from that Ohio publication on fertilizing fruit crops, but like about this table that it breaks down from efficient to below normal, normal, above normal, and excessive. And so if you get your results back and you're in the normal range, this says that, continue as you've been practicing. If it's into the below normal range, then maybe depending on the nutrient, increase it a little bit or take measures to correct its deficiency. Yes, absolutely, you have to take measures to correct the problem. In above normal range, if you fall into that, then cut back on the nutrient if you've been applying some, and of course, if it goes into the excessive range, then stop applying. Okay, if analysis shows the need for nutrients, there's 4 questions that we need to answer. First, how much should be applied? When should it be applied? How often should it be applied? And how should it be applied, either soil or foliar? Factors that have to be considered: the mobility of the nutrient, soil texture, or its cation exchange capacity, which falls in line there. Soil pH, as it affects the nutrient availability, and the soil organic matter content. All are factors that we have to keep in mind here. Now, nitrogen. This is the one that is really is mobile soil. We see more responses from the vine to levels or excessive levels, and so based upon petiole analysis, Carla has come up with this table based upon the Midwest production guide that you're above 1.5% petiole nitrogen, then don't apply any. If you're in the 1.3 to 1.5% level, 20 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre. The 0.9 to 0.3 are the normal expected range, 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and then if you're below that 0.9, 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen. And this is it's a good area to figure on to as a base to begin and see how your vines respond. Now, one thing you have to be other concerns with nitrogen is what if petiole K, potassium, and zinc content. If these are low, you not see a response to nitrogen fertilizers. So be sure to check to make sure that they are in the sufficiency range. Now, as far as what form of nitrogen should be applied, we have 3 forms. We have the nitrate form, the urea, and ammonium forms. Of course, the nitrate forms, these will raise the soil pH. So if you're aware it's low pH, you can use it. They're readily available to the plants. Okay, and with that, grains, probably the need for nitrogen is right at bloom. So if you're using nitrate nitrogen, you could come there closer to that bloom period and apply to get a response. However, nitrate nitrogen is very subject to leaching. Now, urea will change in the pH, although it does slightly reduce the pH. It can be taken up as urea or converted to ammonium nitrogen, then to nitrate nitrogen. It will volatilize under warming soil temperatures and when it's applied. So it's one thing that you have to watch out for going late in the season with it. It will volatilize when surface applied on high pH soils. Ammonium forms. These will lower the soil pH. Slowly available. They must, and of course, you have to be converted to nitrate nitrogen to be taken up by the vines. And that process requires soil temperatures above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Can be tied up on particles, and with that, ammonium forms less prone to leaching. As far as applying nitrogen, how much could be, leached out of the root zone? Carl kind of went into this already. Sandy soils are more prone to leaching, and so can spread out applications half pre-bud break, and then the other half 4 to 6 weeks after bud break. There's one way to approach it. If you're using trickle irrigation, you can apply multiple applications and spread it out, maybe on a weekly basis from bud break to about the 1st of July. Now, you complete fertilizers. Now, should you? Only if there's a need for each of the nutrients. The reasons, one, they're expensive. You have the immobility of potassium, or phosphorus and potassium, and there's also the risk of potassium-induced magnesium deficiency on sandy soils. Phosphorus. This is the one that's practically immobile in soil, and the one that we recommend that you do the pre-soil test and amend before planting. But even say that, generally, phosphorus is not a problem. Plants or vines will do well on low phosphorus soils. The reason for that is phosphorus exists in the soil in an unavailable, intangible, and available form. Kind of an equilibrium there, so a little bit is always coming available. Also, soil microorganisms aid in making phosphorus available. Now, it can, however, be a problem on sandy soils or low exchange capacity soils. And of course, one thing you can do is apply manure, because to try to increase you're getting phosphorus, you're also working to increase the cation exchange capacity. Winery pumice is another that can be applied, and you can apply ammonium monophosphate as nitrogen source if need be. And otherwise, apply phosphorus as a foliar application, and there, of course, refer to the label of the products. Carlos talked earlier, it moves very slowly in the soil. Perennial crops, it takes high rates of potassium to move potassium down into the root. So, if the petiole for potassium, again, from some of Carl's recommendations, if your petiole K is over 2%, you don't need to apply potassium fertilizer. If it's in the 1.5 to 2.0 range, maybe 100 to 200 pounds of K2O per acre. If it's 1% to 1.5, then 200 to 300 pounds per acre, and then it's less than 1% to 400 pounds per acre. Now, when do you apply? If for soil applications, apply when a need has been identified. In other words, if you've done a analysis at the horizon and you set out a need for the potassium, go ahead and apply it as soon as you can, because it takes time for it to move down. Now, in the spring, if you're using potassium nitrate as a nitrogen source, then yes, go ahead and use it in the spring as that nitrogen source. Now, other applications. These are often needed in addition to soil applications when a deficiency has been identified, and maybe the first year for sure, maybe going into second year. Begin applying early in the season. Potassium nitrate or potassium sulfate can be used. Apply 16 pounds per 100 gallons, 1 to 3 applications. And of course, there's a couple of proprietary products, Vigor Grow, Nuche, with the follow directions. But be careful, approach cautiously, because I've seen cases where a vineyard showed potassium deficiency 1 year, and the grower went into foliar, and it was excessive that following year with that. Another way to manage potassium is through mulch, straw mulch under the vines. And of course, what this does is provides straw. You'll get a certain amount of leaching of the potassium out of that, but also you bring with the mulch over, you bring the root zone, roots of the vine up into that region where there's higher concentrations of potassium near the surface. Magnesium, can be a problem on sandy soils, particularly when potassium has been over-applied. And here, if the soil pH is low, then of course dolomitic lime to raise the pH. If the pH is in the optimal range, then either magnesium oxide or Epsom can be applied. And another wet method to go after this is foliar applications of Epsom salt. Generally 10 pounds per 100 gallons, 2 post-bloom applications. Now, because of magnesium can be a problem on some of our calcareous soils, so we have to be careful, and because it will inhibit potassium uptake. Boron, again, this is one that can be low on many Midwest soils, and I should include East soils as well, and on high pH soils. And here, what's critical about boron is that it's involved in fruit set, and so what it does is improve the rate of pollen tube growth, thereby improving fertilization of the flowers. Now, if you need, you can go soil applications or pre or post-bloom foliar applications of soluble. First application, Kim has brought this to my attention. In New York, they find that planting early at the 3-inch growth stage is a good time to begin, and then, of course, follow up with a post-bloom application if needed. Manganese. This one can be low on sandy soils and high pH soils. If it is, include manganese containing fungicides in your early season disease control program. Of course, your manganese, it contains 16% manganese, and with that, you have to be aware of the pre-harvest interval with it. Otherwise, apply chelated forms of manganese as a foliar application. And it can be excessive on low soils, and here, apply lime to raise the pH. Again, it can be low on sandy, high pH, eroded, or level soils. And if it's low, then soil applications of zinc sulfate to bring it up to 6 to 8 pounds of zinc per acre, and include zinc-containing fungicides in your early disease control program. The Magzeb has 2% zinc, Zyram is 16% zinc, so it is a way to kind of kill 2 birds in one stone. And apply chelated forms of zinc as a full spray as well. This can be low on high pH soils and sandy soils. And here, if it is low, and Carl alluded to this earlier, is that apply chelate as a foliar spray and do it at 1 pounds per acre for application, and start early and repeat every 10 to 20 days. Of course, the other is take measures to lower the soil pH. Okay, so, summary. Kind of cover everything we've talked about. Of course, the do soil testing as needed and incorporate. After planting some nitrogen the first year to get the vines off to a start, and then the non-barren years, base your nitrogen applications on the soil's organic matter content, and when production begins, then begin your petiole analysis on an annual basis. Adjust your nitrogen fertilizer rates based on the test results in vine vigor, and apply the other nutrients as needed based on the petiole analysis results. And of course, here, do not apply any nutrients unless there is a need. We have questions.
This is Tim Martinson here, and I'm going to switch over to our upcoming webinar schedule and we can deal with this while we answer questions. Carl, your microphone is unmuted, and Paul's is as well. I see a question here on the chat bar from Nadine Bosek. Hi, Nadine. And that is, Is application of Solubor preferred over foliar applications of Solubor?
Either way, on there. One of the things about foliar is that you're going to get an immediate response that year, whereas soil, soil pH and other factors do have an influence. Carl, you want to add to that?
I guess if it's a pollination problem, you might want to go with the foliar. But if it's just kind of a chronic problem, the soil is the way to go. But again, I'd agree with Paul. You can do either one.
You got to weigh in here too, because I did some work on this many years ago, and we always were reluctant to tell people to routine apply it, but it leach out fast here in the Finger Lakes, and it's not an expensive thing to apply. So I really like the soil applications at the beginning of the season, and it releases it over a long period of time, and you get sort of a different sort of punch from the foliar ones. And we found that sometimes people were getting foliar symptoms when they were doing the a couple of foliar sprays. So I think they both work and they both do different things.
Yeah, and the one thing about boron, of all the essential nutrients, there's a fine line between efficiency and toxicity, and so you can very easily overdo boron. If you go 2-3 times as much as required, then you can get it almost acts as an herbicide in some cases.
Okay, it's been recommended at one time as an herbicide here for creeping ground ivy.
Right. Yeah.
Here's one for you, Tom Higgins. Carl, do you have a specific formula from the soil test that allows you to make the appropriate spacing and canopy decisions for that vineyard site?
That one's a hard one. We don't have any specific recommendations for that. We basically base our recommendations on more on a per acre basis. So what I would say is that as you space it out a little bit more, those zones will probably compensate for closer spacing, so the nutrient levels are probably not all that different. So does that sense? Closer spacing, you tend to get a little reduced growth, whereas if you have wider spacing, you have a little more. That one plant will take up more space then, and that still require those nutrients.
Oh, here's another one from Christoph Kessel. The relationship between percent K and petioles and soil test K by ammonium acetate really poor. Some of our low K petioles with less than 1%, but soil tests can be more than 2%. Anyone else have the same observation? And maybe Carl, you comment on how these would vary.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons we're doing this study with the SCRI. We're seeing similar things. I would, and that's one of the reasons why once you get, the test is good early on, but we really use the plant to tell us what's going on after that. And the plant results might be a little more revealing. Now, one thing that can happen with grapes especially is that your fruit is a very strong sink for potassium. And so you have a heavy crop, you will get low K, even on high K soils. And sometimes you need to take that into account, your crop load, when you're doing your petiole analysis. So
yes, and so much throughout the season.
It does. So
yeah.
Again, you want to make sure that you take it at the appropriate times. So if you're taking it at Verizon, which is the time that we recommend primarily, it's a little more stable during that time. You do have quite a bit of fruit being formed then, and it's an active period. Translocations So you can run into low K under those situations just because the competition between the leaves and the vines, and the leaves and the fruit. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to stand for a little bit more.
Also on that one, we're finding on our dolomitic Rosen soils that we have sufficient soil, but magnesium is so high that it's inhibiting the uptake of potassium.
Yep.
Well, we've been on for a little bit more than an hour here, so I wanted to make a few announcements, and then we can maybe continue for a little bit with questions. First announcement is I'm going to put the URL again for the post-webinar survey. As you leave today, click on that. Should be live on the chat bar, and please answer the questions. Also going to post another. There was a question about where will these sites be posted, and I'm going to put the URL for that as well, because we post those on our Northern Grapes project website. And I've already a PDF on those and posted those there, so that should be there. So that's the URL for that. Our final webinar is going to be April 9th. And I'm very excited to have Greg McConnell, who runs the Farm Credit East Winery Benchmark program. Lots of small wineries here in the East provide financial information, and then he's able to come up with benchmarks for what they're spending and compared with their peers. That's a proprietary service, but he has a lot of insight into winery costs and profitability. So he's going to do that, and then Miguel Gomez from Cornell here is also going to make a presentation. Get wineries about customer satisfaction and how that drives tasting room sales. So I hope many of you can join us for that. We'll proceed again with the questions here, but thanks everybody for attending. Okay, I have another one from Bob Cantwell here. What about compost tea made from vine prunings for fertilizer?
Is this for, are you about soil application or compost? Yeah.
I'm not sure okay. Here. What if I can chime in about that.
You probably aren't getting a whole lot of nutrient out of that. The thing is that the two principal nutrients we're interested in, nitrogen and potassium, and both of those are very mobile in mine. And of course, after Verizon, potassium mobilizes to the fruit. And after the fruit are taken off, it mobilizes to the root system. Nitrogen the same way; it mobilizes to the vine for the end and to the roots. So find a whole lot in the compost tea.
Okay, here I have another one from Steve Unverzak from the first break about cover crops. What type of legume cover crop would best to add nitrogen to the soil?
Are you talking about a permanent crop or pre-plant? I guess those are two different things. If you're, I guess,
yeah,
as a plant.
Yeah.
Okay. So as a pre-plant, any clover or vetch or alfalfa even would good. Assuming that you're going to be incorporated, those would be the ones that would provide the most nitrogen. With grapes, if you're just starting out, it's okay, but you do want to keep your nitrogen down once that vine is starting to produce. But to get started, I'd go with a clover, a vetch, hairy vetch.
Yeah, on alfalfa, in our hygienic soils, I don't even recommend former alfalfa sites for vineyards. There's just too much residual nitrogen there, and vines grow like weeds back to the ground.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with both the not only the legume, but also all that organic matter that's in that soil, so it's a combination. Soon, if you're using a cover crop with legumes, you're probably on a low organic matter soil and one that you're going to need some slow-release nitrogen over time.
Okay, I think we've dealt with most of the questions here.
One question on similable nitrogen and
oh yes, yeah, go for it. Yeah, that was for Paul.
That for Paul. I don't know if you want to go for that one, Paul, but
yeah, what's the relationship between petiole nitrogen and yeast assimilable nitrogen in the grapes?
Why, I'm not the one to ask on that one.
I would only add that if you're truly deficient in nitrogen, there's a relationship. But once you get into that sufficiency range, you're probably not going to. It's going to be more over the board because assimilable nitrogen is affected by a lot of different factors. But if you're totally deficient in nitrogen, it can make an effect.
Yes, and I can add to that because we've done samples over the past 3 years from about 60 different vineyards every year and about 80 different Riesling sites. And you can have two varieties side by side, and one of them will have very adequate value, 250 parts per million. The one door 50 parts per million, and it doesn't have as much to do with the soil. Or, it's the same farmer doing the same sorts of applications. Some of it is very variety specific. Riesling, for example, tends to be a low GAN accumulator. And we haven't really found anything that where we could say, God, got some low nitrogen here in the petioles, and so we're low GAN at the end of the year. It just doesn't seem to work that way. And I think a lot of it has to do with when you get the moisture during the season. But that's speculation. So the answer to that is no. You still have to test your grape in the fall to find out what yeast assimilable nitrogen you have. Okay, any more? I think we'll just stop here then. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Carl and Paul, for presentations. I'll see you again this evening. But thanks for everybody for participation, and please do fill out the post-webinar survey you leave today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, see you later, Tim.
Hey, thanks.
Uh-huh.
Yep. Later.